So sudden, the news can all change. And it kind of has a way of putting what you might call the King of the North back in focus, or a potential King of the North. Let's say if you want a quick summary of Daniel chapter 11, it's basically talking about various kings that rise up either in the north or in the south of Israel. These kings rising up in the north and or south of Israel, this is Israel looking at this kind of geographically, not in Israel, but north of Israel or south of Israel, the eventual location of where this king of the north in particular will stand up. And of course, the king of the north, various prophecies come up, brings what's called Magog into focus, which is Russia. This is why so many said Bible scholars keep their eye on Russia and any potential king rising up there. And many have viewed various kings, let's say, rising up in Magog, Russia, as being the potential Antichrist. Well, again, really, to sum up Daniel chapter 11, what you have really is an angel appearing to Daniel and, of course, talking about the time of the end, as is usually the theme going through the prophecies of Daniel's, having 12 chapters in that book, let's say, the writings of Daniel. And 6 of them in particular, all talking about the last days and the eventual rise of an Antichrist, and culminating in Daniel chapter 10 and 11 and 12, all talking about the same thing and kind of a climax of the same. And Daniel chapter 11, Daniel chapter 10, let's say, is the introduction to the angel, and he's come to give Daniel more information about the time of the end. So he then goes into Daniel chapter 11, is from Daniel chapter 10. And in short, basically the king that the angel is talking about being the king of the north is eventually going to be the Antichrist, after so many kings rising up in the north. Now, it talks, let's say, from Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 up till verses 20, about these various kings that stand up in the north, and they have these constant wars with the king of the south. The south being a kingdom south of Israel, the king of the north being north of Israel, and eventually this culminating in an eventual king that would stand up, that would indeed be the very Antichrist. This is what the prophecy in short is saying without going into every detail. The problem is these days people just haven't got time, unless they're really seriously looking into these things, and these would be few. And Daniel chapter 11 is where we should all be looking, because this has the very words of Jesus in it. Now, these various kings rising up in the north or in the south would eventually go to war. So, in other words, the king of the north will eventually go to war with the king of the south. And this will result in what's called the Great Tribulation. Now, many people these days talk of the Great Tribulation. But where do we find the writings of the Great Tribulation? Yes, Jesus said there would be a Great Tribulation in the last days. It's Jesus who coined the phrase, let's say, the Great Tribulation. But Jesus then telling us in the same chapter, telling us to look into the prophecies of Daniel, let him that readeth understand. So you look for the very words that Jesus spoke, and you're looking really at Daniel chapter 11 regarding the Great Tribulation. Now, this Great Tribulation that kicks off in the last days is largely a result of this scenario this theme that goes through Daniel chapter 11 of the king of the north, king of the south. And these constant wars between the king of the north, king of the south, and the king of the north, and eventually giving rise to the very Antichrist. And then this great war kicking off between the king of the north, king of the south. A time period really whereby the very Antichrist, in order to consolidate all of his ill-gotten gains, as it says in its own words, stretches forth his hands over the countries. And at the same time, you have the king of the south pushing at the king of the north. And so the king of the north comes back in war against the king of the south, this culminating in what's called the Great Tribulation of the last days, just before Jesus returns. Hence, you can see the importance of Daniel chapter 11 regarding what everyone refers to the Great Tribulation as to whether Jesus comes back before or after the tribulation of those days. What are the tribulation of those days? The tribulation of those days will be this culmination of various wars between the king of the north, king of the south, climaxing into a great war in the last days. So let's go to, you have these various kings standing up as from verses 1 to 20 in Daniel chapter 11, king of the north, king of the south, kings of the north, kings of the south. Finally, the Antichrist reaches the angel talking to Daniel, comes to his point. So he's saying there'll be these various kings standing up, north of Israel, south of Israel. And finally, he comes to his main point. The main point here is the theme going through the whole thing is the rise of an Antichrist. So eventually this king stands up in the north. And here he is in verse 21, standing up. Now, in the estate of the former king, right, so there's a former kings, there's many kings standing up in the north, being north of Israel. Eventually you have this king standing up, which is the main theme of these 6 chapters going through Daniel, talking this angel appearing to Daniel, and the name Gabriel comes up on various times, culminating in Daniel 10, 11 and 12. Daniel chapter 11 talking about this very same person, what the same angel called the little horn, that would wax strong in the last days. And indeed stands up in the north, which people interpret this in Daniel, in Ezekiel chapter 38, pointing to the Magog being Russia and Gog being the Antichrist, standing up in the north of Israel. So verse 21, in Daniel 11 verse 21, in short, let's say, it's so hard to get these details out in short, but to be as brief as possible and as clear as possible, which might even mean harping on certain points to make them clear and for emphasis. So here we have in verse 21, so you've had these various kings standing up in Daniel chapter 11, culminating in this king that stands up here in verse 21. So, and in his estate, in other words, in the estate of the former king, one of these other kings that stood up, the one before the very Antichrist, stands up. And this could have a time period spanning over centuries, don't forget. This isn't just talking about a few short years. Though you would say when the Antichrist actually stands up in verse 21 here, talking of the same person, you're suddenly going to go into a time period with all this climaxes, really in a large way, in a lot of ways, in only a few short years. When you look at other prophecies about the Antichrist, he eventually has a very short-lived reign, and particularly talking about the last week of Daniel, which comes up which is the last 7 years of man's history, though under the Antichrist, before Jesus returns. So a very short-lived reign of the very Antichrist. And you're looking at largely the last 7 years of man's history under the devil, therefore under the Antichrist, before Jesus returns. The time period that Jesus called lo, he says, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. In other words, the end of this age where man looks to himself and his own genius, looks to the devil and his genius, and eventually will look to and align himself with the very Antichrist, the very son of Lucifer, the son of the devil on earth. So this is the age we're in, the age of man, the age of Satan, really, and the age of science. This is man and his genius, and the eventual alliance that man will make with the very Antichrist, even the king of the north, king of the south, eventually have going into this peace covenant under the very Antichrist. Now this brings us into the last week of Daniel. This last week of Daniel, and this great holy covenant that the whole world signs up to, the various religions of the world, and the various political persuasions, largely talking there about the king of the north, king of the south, and the great political persuasion in the last days is going to be the king of the north, largely communistic countries, autocratic countries, and king of the south being the capitalistic, materialistic, mystery Babylon the Great countries. Now, Mystery Babylon the Great is the great queen that sits on many waters. And many waters in the prophecies there, talking in the book of Revelation, the waters are symbolic of the peoples of the world. So Mystery Babylon the Great, the more capitalistic, said democratic, free world countries, in other words, do what their will, countries do what their will, really, in short, is the whole law of witchcraft, and really the Mystery Babylon the Great, the great mother of harlots and whore of Babylon, that sits on many waters, is portrayed as being largely a witch. Has she, by her sorceries, it says, were all nations deceived. So symbolically, we're talking about a witch, a whore, the whore of Babylon being a witch. In fact, by her sorceries, were all nations deceived. She sat on many waters, and many great world empires and kingdoms down through the ages, and she sat on the back of every great world empire down through the ages. Even, you might say, the king of the north, king of the south had Mystery Babylon sat on the back of her being the power and the driving force behind every kingdom and nation on earth. By her and by her sorceries were all nations deceived, it says. So this final great war breaks out between the king of the north, king of the south, and what's happening here is the king of the north is trying to shake off Mystery Babylon the Great off of the back of empires, really, of kingdoms. And therefore you can't help but visualize this great war that breaks out between the king of the north, king of the south, being the great war that breaks out between the upcoming New World Order that's coming in. And these, it says, particularly culminating with these 10 kings that align themselves with the very Antichrist, these shall hate the whore, shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Hence you have this great war between the king of the north, king of the south. And you view this great war, really, the king of the north, as being communism coming in and sweeping around the whole world. And capitalism refusing Mystery Babylon the Great. She's always sat on the back of every great nation, every great kingdom, every great empire even. She refusing to yield up her power, and therefore they go into an alliance with each other. But in this alliance between the king of the north, king of the south, they are lying to each other around one table. This being the very covenant that will be signed in the last days with the various religions of the world, whether it's the religion of man, really the New World Order being the religion of man, pitting his wits against God. Man pitting his wits against God and aligning himself with the very Antichrist in the last days, the mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the so-called free democratic world, do what thou wilt world, making this, going into this alliance with the very Antichrist in the last days, this king of the north that stands up and imposes his will upon the whole world. Well, here we are in verse 21, Daniel chapter 11. It talks of this king that's going to stand up in the north. Now, who this king will be, and of course you have now Putin on the move. This isn't to say that Putin is the very king of the north that this prophecy is talking about. But you have to keep your eyes on and finger on the pulse. Eventually, this king of the north will stand up. And it talks of his tactics and how he comes to power in the north. So he comes in as a kind of an outsider of sorts, it says here. So in verse 21, so in his estate, the estate of the former king of the north, so you have this final king of the north standing up here. This is the final one in the north, by the way, which is going to be the Antichrist. And in his estate, in the former estate of the former king of the north, shall stand up a vile person, and this is the Antichrist, to whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom. So he's coming to power in the north. And they don't appear to him to at first give him the honour of the kingdom, which kind of puts him into the category of a kind of an outsider of sorts. They don't accept him at first. To whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom, but, so this is his tactics now, but he shall come in peaceably. So he's coming in as a man who's he's saying he's going to bring peace even to the northern region here. So he's coming in peaceably, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So in other words, he comes in with peace proposals. He's coming in peaceably, presents himself as a man of peace, and he uses flattery. Now, there's an interesting verse about flattery in the Bible, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage. In other words, he'll flatter people and make them feel really proud and great. And they will form alliances with him. And so he comes to power through flattery, having men's persons in admiration. So he'll admire all these other leaders or peoples even, and flatter them and make them feel really special, really important, having men's persons in admiration. Why? Because of advantage, because it's advantageous to him to flatter these other kingdoms, peoples, in order to form an alliance with them. And they make this great peace with him and form alliances with him. But he uses other tactics too. So he comes in peaceably, so he uses peace. In other words, he uses flattery. And it goes on, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him. He also uses his military muscle and might and war, and imposes his will upon them either through peaceful means, either through flattery, or even through war. Either way you look at it, he comes in and gets his way. He is a vile person. The person that St. Paul called the man of sin, that would rise up in the last days. So you can't trust this man. He proposes peace. He uses flattery, but he can also do war. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him. So you picture this great flood of arms, flood of material, military might and muscle coming in, sweeping over these various lands in the north. He's coming to power in the north here. and shall be broken. So these various kingdoms and peoples are broken. Yea, now the angel talking to Daniel names this man. This is the one. This is the king that I've been talking about all along. This is the final culmination of all of these various kings that stand up in the north, finally culminating with this king, this eventual king that will stand up, which will indeed be the very Antichrist. And so he's saying, with the arms of a flood, they're eventually broken, right, with the arms of a flood, so they be overflowing from before him, and shall be broken. So he's quite good at war. He's very clever at deceit, and he's very clever at war. Yea, also the prince of the covenant. Now he's pointing to who this man is. This king that rises up in the north, that uses peace, that uses flattery, that uses war to get his way. The angel is now naming him, yea, also the prince of the covenant. This is the prince of the covenant. This is the one I've been talking about. This is the one that comes in with this last week of Daniel. In other words, last week here being a Hebrew word being Shabuah, meaning 7 years. This 7-year peace covenant that this Antichrist man eventually makes with the war, with the whole world. Now, you're in verse 23 now. So he comes to power in the north, and after the league made with him, he gains power in the north. In other words, after the league made with him. So he's bringing people in the north into an alliance with him, either through peace, flattery, or war, and eventually they make a league with him. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. For he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. So strangely enough, he comes to power with a small people here in the north, and not with a great army and great people necessarily, as you might expect. But it's saying that he comes to power with a small people. Could be a small people as in the poor. It could be a smaller nation. Either way you look at it, he comes to power with he shall become strong with a small people. More of his tactics here. So he becomes strong with a small people. You might say the list of tactics here now is he comes in peaceably, he uses peace, he uses flattery, he uses war. He also comes to power with a small people. So various tactics, talking about how this king of the north comes to power and how they eventually make a league with him. So